The biggest, toughest test, pre-test, is now out the way. The Lions have beaten the Brumbies pretty comprehensively in the end. This was the #1 ranked Aussie team over Super Rugby. The Lions put out, you'd say, almost inarguably the strongest team they have so far, and they dispatched them. What do you make of the performance today?
Really relieved, to be honest. I went into that game quite worried or like nervous as a Lions fan. And to come out with that, not only having won the game, but having kind of put them away. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of kind of like chinks in the Lions' armour, a few things that could be of a little bit of concern. The Brumbies did play very well, but that's what you'd expect of them. And so to score 38 points against a team that good is really, really pleasing from a Lions perspective.
And with 2 tries chalked off that very easily could have been given, potentially even 3, it felt like they were the most serious the Lions have been so far. We saw them be more direct than I think they have been. There's been a lot of criticism in the last couple of weeks on, are they trying to play too much rugby? They're trying to be too expansive. We saw 4 years ago, the Lions turn up in South Africa. They played incredibly expansive, incredibly wide over the tour games. They got into the test and they tightened right up. And I think we saw a little bit of that. I don't think it's going to happen as drastically, but I think we saw something close to what the game plan is going to be once we get into those tests, which the first one's in 10 days' time, right? So they needed the run out, they needed the chance to do that. And I think we saw something more closely resembling how they're going to play this weekend. Yeah,
definitely. With regards to some of the selections that people were going on about in terms of, is this in the test team? I think the main one that people would have discussed would have been the halfbacks, with Russell and Gibson Park. You made the point in the previous video that still Gibson Park hasn't played with another halfback on this tour other than Finn Russell. That stands. Marcus Smith obviously came on at 15, but he hasn't played with a different 10. And Russell, I thought, he's been really good throughout this tour, right? But that was his best performance, I think, so far, because it was so maturely managed. When you think about, there was that one kick that he put in towards the end where he went for the corner. As soon as the Lions' attack started to look dodgy and shapeless, suddenly he went, right, let's just get back on the front foot then here, lads. And yeah, throughout his distribution, the Tom Curry try is a really, really good example of the two of them working in tandem together. It's how quickly the ball is already in Russell's hands, thanks to Gibson Park's pass, before the Brumbies can get off the line, which is something they're very, very good at. You know, you look at the likes of Rory Scott, the likes of Cairden Neville, like players who are really good at, Tom Hooper, really good at getting off the line. And the ball is already in Russell's hands nice and early. And he shapes, without even needing to really move the ball, that long ball over the top to Tommy Freeman. Just his body language suggests that he's going to go for this all the time. Instead goes the double pump and just hits Tom Curry in that short one, who offloads and Marcus Smith scores. It is just a really good way of stretching the line, just because Finn Russell and Gibson Park between them have these stretchy passes on at all times, and it makes it so hard to defend.
And you've got this clear sense of the two of them growing to play together and growing to understand each other. And part of that is in that case, I think it was Gibson Park understanding what Russell wants and how Russell plays and where he wants to distribute and where he wants the pass to be. Conversely, you look at Ollie Chesham's try, and that is a case of Finn Russell understanding how Jameson Gibson Park plays, right? And what he wants. So Russell gets so much wider than he normally would, so much wider than we're used to seeing him play, where he likes to be near the breakdown. We've seen it so much on this tour of them playing off 10, of him being near the ruck and then playing off that. Normally, right, we'd see Finn Russell stand much closer, much tighter, and then throw the ball over the top to Chesham or, perhaps a winger, perhaps, Lowe is filled in out there, whatever. Instead, he goes, no, Gibson Park has that pass, as he said, that stretchy pass, that incredibly quick pass. He throws a brilliant ball that skips out, I think, 4, maybe even 5 defenders, gets over to Russell, who only has to engage one guy and drop it off to Chesham, who scores in the corner. It's a brilliant example of the two of them having now played together long enough that Russell has adapted his game in order to work with Gibson Park.
That's such a good point. Because if you look at that back line in isolation, you would say Finn Russell stood in sort of the outside centre fullback type channel. And when we did our preview before the URC final, what we were saying is you kind of have to take for granted the fact that Jameson Gibson Park throws passes like that, where it loops around people. And you're right, Finn Russell is reading that already. And he's standing in positions where he's going, no, I'm still the first receiver, but I'm going to target somebody else. Because they can't just move all onto him. They've got to mark. You've got big forwards who are running up the middle instead, like a Jack Conan or somebody. You can't just leave a big gap for him or else he'll just run into it. And as you say, he times that pass brilliantly. I think maybe the highlight for me of Finn Russell's whole game was the decision early on to run it out of his 22. Because here, once again, as a Lions fan or as a Scotland fan, a Bath fan, whoever, and sometimes your heart's in your mouth, and sometimes you're thinking, oh, maybe he's just getting it wide to bring the wingers up so somebody else can kick the ball further down. But This blends into something else which is pretty much guaranteed in the Test team, and that is Dan Sheehan being on the wing. And the luxury of this is the fact that the Lions play essentially with an 8-man backline, that they can use the likes of James Lowe. Obviously, Matt Hansen wasn't playing at this point in the game, but Blair Kinghorn, likewise, Tommy Freeman, Duan when he plays, right? They can use them in different roles. All of those wingers other than Duan that I mentioned can be used as playmakers, can be used as fly halves. And in this case, right, you're looking at Bundy Arkey and Gary Ringrose can work as forwards as well. So you can take one man out the back line, you've not lost anything. And so Dan Sheehan, when he gets the ball on the wing, typically you see your edge forward get this, if it's a back row forward or hooker, whoever, and you go, right, take a safe carry, set up, and then we'll kick. Instead, he takes his man on the outside.
Hell of a fend.
Yeah, outstanding fend and gets 40 metres downfield. And going for a different formation, and I think we'll get on to potentially another time how the Lions have varied their formations as they've gone along. But the way that they can vary it from an 8-7, as in forwards to backs ratio, to a 7-8 forwards to backs ratio, makes a hell of a difference.
Yeah. Massively. Dan Sheehan, I thought, was hugely impressive.
Yeah.
He has pretty much nailed himself into the Test team. I think, other than Itoje, he's probably the safest name in there. However, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, because I do think there's an awful lot about this Lions performance that is incredibly encouraging, beyond just those individual performances. I think they did, as I said, play much more direct. We saw them... It was interesting, the first phase moves they were deploying, which were often much shorter. They were midfield carries and they played phase play off that. And it feels a little bit like, and it's something Ireland do a lot, right, is they vary that. And it feels like over the last few weeks, the Lions have been perhaps playing to width. And perhaps it's Finn Russell having a whole new box of toys, you know, the Ireland playbook, which, as Matt Hansen said after the Western Force game, we're literally just using the island calls, like right down to the word they're using to initiate them.
Did you see that Finn had them written on his hands?
Really?
As well, yeah. And he showed them to the camera and said they'll be different by Saturday, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, but I don't know if he's just like playing that box. He's like, oh, cool, I've got a wide player coming in here.
Yeah.
Or a player where I touch the ball 3 times. I want to do that. Maybe. But we saw the Lions play much more direct plays. There were far more plays that were looking to get Conan or Arkey carrying up the middle, or little short balls to drop it off, including the one that leads to Ringrose's try, right? Which is a short play looking to get over the gain line, but Ringrose throws that dummy, and instead they're able to make the break and he goes right through. You mentioned when we were talking about it off air, but like, it is almost identical to one that Ireland ran in the World Cup.
Yeah, 2 minutes into the game against Scotland, where he throws exactly the same dummy to the motion and sets up Matt Hansen to go through this gap here, sheerly just because Ireland sent so many runners and overwhelmed the Scottish defence and stretched them at the last second. It's very much the same thing they do to Brumbies here. Marcus Smith's running line off there, and then he kind of snakes through to get in that support line. He does really, really well.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And that was hugely encouraging. I think, seeing the Lions kind of... I don't think they're correcting. I don't think they're changing anything. I think we just saw something close to the Test, like, mindset.
Yeah.
Right down to the fact they kicked a penalty with like 20 minutes to go when they were 2 scores up already.
Utter woke nonsense. Yes.
The first penalty of the kick since the Argentina game. Like, they were very much like, no, we're going to approach this properly. We're going to approach this like it's the Test. And what decision we make in that case? From a, like, practical, tactical point of view in terms of kicking those points, but also from what calls is Finn Russell playing. We want him calling the plays that he will call in a Test rather than the plays that he'd call in order to rack up the biggest score against a club team, which is what they've broadly been doing up until now. And that backfired against the Waratahs and didn't work because they were taking a lot of risks and a lot of them didn't come off, a lot of Charlie Gambles, if you will. However, against the Brumbies today, we have seen them just like be much more straight and much more direct and much more impactful of a result.
Yeah, I'd imagine that that's what Andy Farrell's told them.
Yeah.
Is he's used that language of this is the 4th Test. You know,
Yeah.
you think 4 years ago there was the South Africa A game where that was the language used there. You think here that is probably what Farrell's been saying to them of you approach everything about this as a test. And it sounds like weird and corny, right? But them kicking that goal is a reminder to those players that every time the opposition make a break, you've got to work that 10% harder, like it's a test match, to actually get back and stop them. Or every time you make a break, you've got to actually get there and clear the breakdown out. You know, and a lot of these players will have one foot in the Test team. And as we mentioned in the preview, they could easily play themselves out by not having the work rate that they did. And in the end, approaching that as a Test match, it probably gave them a little bit of that edge that they need.
Yeah. You mentioned the breakdown. I do want to talk about the Brumbies a bit because yes, they were kind of blown away a little bit by the Lions being incredibly physical, incredibly direct, and also, having that expansive game to them. But I did think the Brumbies were very good.
Yeah.
For a depleted Brumbies team, that was a pretty decent outing from them. I think there was a few stand-up performances, almost all of them, the forwards. The Corey Toole had a very good game. I thought Ryan Lonergan at scrum half also was excellent.
He was outstanding. Yeah. His kicking game was phenomenal, and defensively as well.
Yeah,
the turnover he got when Gibson Park went for a slightly foolish snipe, it was one of those where they slightly baited him and then he got over the ball. He was outstanding.
Yeah. Caden Neville, I thought was excellent. I thought he was very good. He's a huge man, made his impact felt. Big man, I don't know if you noticed.
Yep.
But I thought maybe their two standout players were Tom Hooper and Rory Scott, who were absolutely brilliant in the back row, because, again, an issue for the Lions was the breakdown, same as against the Waratahs on Saturday. And there is question marks now raising there over that as potentially, I wouldn't say a problem area, but it's an area in which they've been get-atable.
Yeah, I think part of us probably knew this was coming, because when you sacrifice a back row forward for a second row, you're potentially taking 20% off the breakdown and adding it to the line out. And there's huge pluses to that, because Chesham was outstanding.
Chesham was brilliant.
He got the charge down on Lonergan again in the second half as well, and he added so much around the park. And he does work as a functional back row forward, but again, he doesn't give you the same amount of impact on attacking ball that a Van der Fleer will, that a Pollock will, that a Morgan will, right, when they're all on the bench. So, yeah, it's an interesting one. I'd imagine that it's given Farrell a bit of a head scratcher ahead of what back row he's going to pick in the test team.
Yeah, I think it was interesting that when you look at that Waratahs game, right, the likes of Charlie Gamble, who was outstanding, probably the best player on the pitch that day, was getting over the top and actively looking for turnovers and to slow the ball down by grabbing onto it and forcing someone to clear him out, right?
Yeah.
Where this week, instead, we saw Tom Hooper and Scott take a completely different approach to that, which was to blast the breakdown, which was try and counter rug, to try and just nudge it and hit it. And we saw that entire Brumbies pack really go at that. And they, in a completely different way, managed to disrupt the Lions ball entirely. They did a really good job on it. There are a few rucks where, Mitchell had one at the end where he had to reach down and spend about half an hour trying to pull the ball out. He had one where Gibson Park was basically being turned over and managed to turn it back over himself in order to pull the ball out from the ruck.
Yeah.
They did a really good job of just making the ruck messy, and that slowed the Lions' ball down an awful lot. We saw them play, even though I think their goal clearly was to look to use that more direct rugby to generate fast ball. They didn't get to do that much of it. When they got into 22, I thought they were incredibly accurate, and they did manage to do that a bit better. In the 22, they were a bit more switched on. I think around halfway, we saw them drop more forward into the wide channels. They were kind of playing more sort of 1-3-2-2. And having an extra forward. Often it was a loose head prop, it was Gendra, it was Porter, in those wider channels, where once we got into 22, they were bringing it a bit narrower, only having one edge forward, kind of going to the 1-3-3-1, which they alternate between the two of them consistently, which I think is interesting. But that allowed them in the 22 to be incredibly accurate. And I wonder if they need to maybe switch some of that in, or as you say, look at that back row selection, right? And do you look at Tom Curry and Jack Morgan as the two most effective, efficient, clean-out options on their own ball as the guys you want to dump in there?
On the other side of that, talking about what's satisfying as a Lions fan is the fact that they overcame that.
Yeah.
That the breakdown was so messy and they're having to drag different players in there and slightly lose a bit of shape. But there are players in this team who are so versatile that it doesn't matter. I mentioned Dan Sheehan earlier. Tom Curry is very much one of those. Ollie Chesham is a guy who really surprises me, because you think of him as a punchy middle forward, but actually, when he's out wide, there's no real issue. It's not like there's any alarm bells there. Jack Conan likewise. And so when you're getting the likes of Bundy Archie dragged into the breakdown, there are players who can fill those positions out in the back line, whose numbers on their back will indicate their forwards.
Yeah.
So from a Lions perspective, that is quite encouraging, because you would imagine that based on the tape that they've got so far, Joe Schmidt will be banging Australia on the breakdown all week next week and just saying, look, I don't care who they're picking in the back row, we have to test them out, because we've got Fraser McWright. We can bully them. Fraser McWright as well is arguably the best at blasting breakdowns in the world. He's very good over the ball, but his main way of getting turnovers is by knocking people out the way in breakdowns. And so he will be leaning so heavily on that guy.
Yeah, and that is a huge factor for the Lions, I think. A really significant thing is, can they sort the breakdown out ahead of the first test? Because the Brumbies and the Waratahs have both shown there's a way to disrupt them there. I think to mention the Brumbies a little bit more, I thought they took their tries incredibly well. You look at that opening try which again brings in another element of the Lions, right? I thought in terms of, as we're talking about them having that test match mentality, the way in which they got off the line, that tight five in particular, I thought were outstanding. I thought Ellis Genge was really good.
Yeah.
Both, he got some decent carries in there, but scrummaged incredibly well. That was a huge factor there. But also the way in which he was getting off the line, disrupting the ball. If you look at the phases leading up to the opening try, that it is him getting up and getting in the faces, then Furlong does a similar thing a moment or two later of getting over and dragging bodies into the ruck and managing to make a complete mess of it. And in the end, right, the Brumbies go over the top. I think that's the only way they could have scored the try, because they were getting knocked back and really disrupted around the fringes. And maybe it's something the Lions have got to look out for, is that ball over the top. But it's better to concede that try in the opening minutes against the Brumbies than it is in a test match.
Yeah, and it's funny because the Crichton try later on is kind of the inverse of that, in that they leave the gap open rather than leaving that ball over the top. There was a lot of, I'd say, quite positive debate about this on the television, and a lot of extremely negative debate going on Twitter about this, of people blaming the other country's players for everything, or claiming that that's what the commentators were doing. Very strange. But really, what this comes from is the fact that the Brumbies get a bit of a nudge on the scrum.
Yeah.
And so therefore, Gibson Park has to at least have in the back of his mind that the 8 or the 9 could go. Now, if you break this down, and if you were to put the blame on somebody here, it would be Gibson Park, right? Because he, if we're talking factually, marks the wrong player given what the Brumbies do. There's obviously the chance that he sits off, he goes to 10, and the Brumbies pick up and Lonergan dives in the corner, whatever. Yeah. That is entirely possible. But yeah, the issue isn't actually just Freeman leaving this space out here. It is about what comes 2 players inside him. And Ringrose, there's not much he can do here.
Likewise, that scrum being so on top means you have to keep both flankers in. You have to keep that weight in the scrum so they can't break off. It allows that ball to get outside that channel quicker. And also, if you're the 2 backs out there, doesn't matter what you're doing, if you're Ringrose or Freeman, both of them are left in a tricky situation because the 2 players they're relying on to close off that space haven't done so. So they are kind of relying on 2 players that don't do it and make them both look very silly. Yeah,
and don't get me wrong, given this has happened and Gibson Park has stitched you up a little bit, in Freeman's case, you probably do want to mark Crichton and force them to go for a longer pass over the top, ball in the air a little bit longer, could potentially give Gibson Park or one of the flankers a chance to get across, or even Finn Russell is covering in the backfield a little bit here. But once again, it's one of those things that he doesn't need us to tell him. He's got Andy Farrell there.
Can we talk about Ollie Chesham?
Let's talk about Ollie Chesham.
I thought he was brilliant.
He was.
I thought he was very much in contention for man of the match, if not man of the match.
Yeah.
Finn Russell and Itoje were both brilliant as well. Both Irish centres.
They gave it to Gibson Park, which
game.
I found
Park, I get,
he was good, but I wouldn't have given it to him. I'd have probably agreed with you and gone Chesham. I think
Chesham was probably the outstanding candidate to me. I thought he was phenomenal. In terms of someone that needed the big game to force their way into the test team, he literally couldn't have done any more.
Yeah.
We saw him used incredibly effectively as an edge forward, something he did even when he was in second row beforehand. But also they were bringing him off that wing and using him in tight, and he was hitting angles, he was working in, particularly once they got into 22, and they'd use him as more of a kind of like impact carrier and hitting lines, whereas wider out, further back, he was being used in those wide channels. And he just showed that he can fit into whatever the system is in attack and defence flawlessly.
Yeah, 100%. And again, he's such a threat on the fringes of that breakdown that, you think ahead to the test series, a Tate McDermott will be licking his lips at the possibility of going around the fringes, and he will be shutting that down all day long.
I thought his lips are thought of eating Tate McDermott.
Yeah, that more importantly. I thought actually all 3 of that kind of middle 3 in the pack for the Lions were outstanding. Itoje was brilliant.
Yeah.
Just once again, he's just a very consistent leader and always moves forward. Joe McCarthy again really, really impressed me. I think this example here where the Brumbies make a break and he's basically the only player who's managed to get back on side for the Lions. His work rate's exceptional and he triple jobs here. And if not for the fact that he takes responsibility and does like a centre's job in covering everybody, covers the head, the tip, the guy out the back, the guy running the hard line, the person out the back, he covers all of it so well and gets off the line. His first 3 steps are so aggressive and he covers it to the point where the Brumbies have to then fumble the ball and take it in. If not for Joe McCarthy's involvement here, or if he's 10% softer in his line speed, the Brumbies are definitely scoring off this. And so, yeah, with that and Chesham and Itoje, it's so difficult because we've talked about the back row and trying to say, how can we get Curry and Morgan in this? As well as how well the Van der Pollock combo worked off the bench, right? How on earth can we... And Ben Earl as well, who's phenomenal, outstanding, and Jack Conan's been brilliant on tour this whole time, right? How on earth do we get all of these into the squad? Because Ollie Chesham has put his hand up in a way, and Ty Bird as well. Like, there's so much quality in here. But as you say, Ollie Chesham has put himself into a point where how are you going to turn around to that guy and say, sorry, mate, you're on the bench this week?
Yeah, that's the tricky thing, isn't it? And that's going to be the case across the board, right? There are going to be players who have played themselves into contention for any other team who are going to be left on the bench here, which is what you want if you're Andy Farrell.
Yeah.
Few other points to pick up on, I think. We mentioned the defence. I thought that was a real step up in terms of what they were able to do in terms of forcing teams back and disrupting them, but also scrum and maul. We saw them maul the ball much more than I think they have in the last few weeks. And the scrum went really well with a couple of exceptions. I think we saw that front row that started, I think will be the test front row of Gen, Sheehan and Furlong. Furlong I thought was massive.
He was monstrous.
He did everything he needed to kind of say that I'm back, forget about my injuries, put all that to the back of your mind, I am the guy.
We are going to cover our test selections, or what we think the likely test selection is at the first half of next week, after the next game. However, you're right about the front row. And also, like, that Furlong, Beelum, Stewart's been a bit of a three-way arm wrestle so far, but Furlong's really thrown his name into the hat there. I think that's going to be a good discussion when we
But I think the good thing about this was, right, we saw Genge and Furlong tire a little bit, and we saw the Brumbies start to get on top for literally like 2 scrums.
Yeah.
And then they changed them. And Porter came on and absolutely marmalised them. And I think it showed what a strong axis that is. And we don't really get to see Andrew Porter as an impact player, right? No. Because Cian Healy is 86 years old and can't play beyond 20 minutes. So generally, he is starting and playing most of the game. So him using and being such a good impact player, and I think a better impact player than maybe Ed Genge would be, I think, who has nailed himself in as the starter anyway, I think. So I thought that was a hugely pleasing
It's a good
thing.
axis, isn't it?
It is. It's not bad to have.
The other point as well, especially talking about defensively, is the centres. The Archie and Ringrose, we know these guys play with each other all the time for Ireland. But again, that's a real head scratcher. Again, we'll come on to this next week. But there's 2 really well-established centre combos together. I would imagine he's going to keep one of the 2 together.
I think so.
Rather than mixing and matching between the 2 of them. And it's so interesting that now 2 games in a row we've come away and gone, the centres was one of the big talking points.
Yeah.
You'd hate to be Andy Farrell at that point, wouldn't you? It's such a good dilemma to have.
Ringrose had his best game on tour.
He was outstanding.
Superb.
Again, another man of the match contender was Ringrose. Again, that's one of those where when you're suddenly supporting him, you notice all the little tiny things he does, and you do a little bit anyway. But at the same time, you kind of start to appreciate them a little bit more.
Yeah.
When he runs little dummy lines, or he makes a good defensive read that saves you 5 metres rather than a full line break. Just, the dude is such a smart rugby player.
He's incredibly smart. With the ball as well. The dummy lines he runs, the way he hits those lines. The fact that the one time he does throw dummy, instead of doing the kind of following the play, it leads to a try.
Yeah.
Because he's never thinking about himself. He's always thinking bigger picture. He's one of those guys, like George Ford's another one, and there's some of these players, right, you can tell they're not thinking about rugby as an individual glory thing. He's not thinking, how can I score a try? How can we do this?
Yeah.
He's just thinking like, okay, we have a task which is to get this egg thing over to there. Like, and how do I logically solve this problem? As though it is a logic problem rather than like a sporting occasion.
Yeah.
And you love watching that. And likewise, you know, in defence, preventing the opposition doing that. He's just an incredibly intelligent rugby player. And I thought Joe Defaki as well, he looked more like himself, you know, looked right up to speed in that 12 shirt.
Yeah, 100%. One more thing we kind of have to talk about is the James Lowe thing that happened. Because it was a bit of a howler.
Yeah.
So a lot of people have, I think, quite rightly pointed out that this comes just after Blair Kinghorn picks up his injury.
Yeah.
He doesn't really draw anybody in at this point when he gives James Lowe the pass and he bombs this try. The thing is, James Lowe is a world-class winger on a Lions tour. He should finish this regardless.
Yes.
The winger's primary job is to score tries. He brings so much else to this team. So do not come at him and go, oh, he bombed this, therefore he can't play Test rugby. It's not that deep.
It's
but
just a bizarre finishing choice.
It is.
That he, instead of just reaching out and scoring or sliding, goes to try and turn his shoulder and back into the player. It's Muirhead. And it
Brilliant by Muirhead, by the
Muirhead
way.
being able to get under him and wrap him up. Like, he takes a risk that he didn't have to take.
Yeah.
When he could go low immediately and score this, instead he goes, right, I want to win the contact which is kind of the emergency option if we're about to go into touch. He has more room than he thinks he does. I think it's just a really poor choice on the finish there from Lowe. He's not normally like this. He's normally a brilliant finisher. We've seen him score these so many tries, and he does it a few minutes later with a really weird dive where you kind of think like, are you going to blow it again?
I think it was quite self-aware, wasn't it, that he had to dive early because of what happened a minute ago. I think he was a little bit red-faced, which is rare for James Lowe, because you'd probably say any of the other wingers, arguably any of the other backs on tour would have scored that. Sheehan would have scored that. Like Jack Conan would have. Like the players who are used to scoring tries would have all got that. And James Lowe, probably, any other day of the week, would have scored that.
Yeah. It felt a bit like a guy getting the yips. You know, just forgetting like the most basic component of his job and just being unable to do it there. So it's reassuring he got that second one in and was able to finish that off. But
once again, I wouldn't say that has any bearing of his test chances because he brings so much else.
You glazed past it, but the one real negative out this game for the Lions, and I think we're very up in the performance overall.
Yeah.
And I think there are obviously rough areas, but I think broadly that was a big boy performance that really shut down the Brumbies team. And yes, the Brumbies are missing a lot of players, but I saw enough there that if they tighten a bit of timing, if they keep this team largely together, I think if Farrell does, obviously there'll be room for a few players to be able to squeeze their way in individually, but you get all the combinations together and get them training for 10 days without worrying about the testing. Whereas Clive Woodward's done, just go, you go off and train over there. We'll get the other guys over here that are going to prepare to play the Anzac team and get the timing up and get that. I think the only issues were timing and tiny little bits like that. I think broadly it looked like the game was roughly there. The one concern is Blair Kinghorn's injury.
Yeah, big time, big time. And this might be something where we need a bit of time. We'll discuss that on our video about test selection. However, yeah, that's a real concern because I think he was starting to get slightly groomed as the potential test starter. The good news is there is also a Hugo Keenan in this squad. And also, like, Marcus Smith obviously had a couple of moments where he dropped the ball and so on, but generally across the board he looked quite solid. To say fullback isn't his position.
Yeah.
There is a mild alarm bell there, and I really hope that Kinghorn is fit because I think he probably is the guy who's going to be the favourite for that shirt, but we'll have to see as time goes along.
Do you call someone up?
I don't think there's really time to call somebody up.
I both agree with you and think if Hugo Keenan gets injured, it's an issue.
That's a good point.
And so Hugo Keenan's been carrying an injury already. He's been ill, right? He's not trained much. We don't know if he's fit fully, right? It might be that the illness has knocked a lot out of him.
Yeah.
So do you leave yourself in a situation where you bring in Freddie Stewart, who I think would be my next choice?
He would be the next in line.
Again, I've said it before. Blair Murray, I get it, I respect it, but if you're saying Blair Murray should be a line, you're not a serious person.
He also wasn't that good against Japan on the weekend, Blair Murray, so he did himself no favours, whereas Stewart was outstanding against Argentina.
Freddie Stewart is the next cab of the rank. Do you get him in purely so he can learn the calls just in case? And yes, he'll probably only get 80 minutes at most.
Yeah.
But you want him just in case Hugo Keenan picks up an injury in the second test. And then you are left, bam, Stewart's got to play the third test.
Decent way to earn 100 grand if you're Stewart, isn't it? But also, you've got a point because he's an out-and-out fullback. And it's funny because when Daly got ruled out, we're going like, don't worry lads, we've got two fullbacks who are suddenly fit again. Suddenly that whole thing's flipped on its head, isn't it? And we are now thinking about the fact that Tommy Freeman might need to slide across there in a test. Or that Marcus Smith might need to come on in a test. Exactly, and play at fullback. And suddenly you are a bit stretched.
Hugh Jones at 15.
Exactly, any of this is possible. And so you are right, let's say Keenan gets injured in test 2, Stewart's had a blinder in the midweek game, and suddenly you kind of go, well, test 3, let's just put in the guy who you know will catch every ball. So maybe you do call up Freddie Stewart. Yeah. He's definitely the next cab of the rank in terms of fullbacks. And, you know, there's plenty of other wingers that you could call up. But once again, that's not the issue. It's not about calling up the best guys. It's about calling up the most replicable person for Blair Kinghorn. Yeah. And that is probably Stewart.
OK, so overall, this Lions performance in a couple of words?
What's a Brumbie?
Big boy time. I'd go with this Brumbies performance in a couple of words.
Brumbie is horse.
Just solid, like respectable. You know, this wasn't a set the world alight performance. It wasn't like the Waratahs fans saying they won 10-24. It was very much just like no, you know, we're stable, we're okay, we did all right. Like we were respectable. Wasn't the heights of 12 years ago, but they laid out a path to, you know, something also they've given Joe Schmidt something to look at. They've given Joe Schmidt something to look at and go, oh, interesting. We can get them in that way with the breakdown and with a little bit, you know, they disrupted the line out incredibly well as well. I also thought as one kind of final point, like the Lions, yes, won a lot of their ball, but a lot of it wasn't that clean, and a lot of it they weren't able to play off. So.
Which is a red flag with everything we were saying about the 2 second row thing.
So interesting, strong performance. Another game coming up on Saturday. Let's see how they get on against the AUNZ 15. I'm very excited for that because a lot of the kind of Australian highlights of this tour are going to re-emerge, and that's what the Lions is all about. Yeah, a superstar team of the players from the rest of the tour. It's exciting.
We shall see you there.
We will
not at the game.
No, we're not going to be there. We could fly out if you want.
We'll see
we
you
have
there.
to get going about now.
Figuratively.